Bow your heads. And this reading has something to do with the talk today. So and you can tell me at the end if you see the connection between the prayer and the talk. This holy man fought to the death for the law of his God and did not fear the words of the godless, for he was built on solid rock. The Lord granted him a stern struggle that he might know that wisdom is mightier than all else. Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me, says the Lord. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it in eternity, says the Lord. Amen.
Amen.
So I'll just start again with a couple of basics about surveys. I think those of you who attended my session probably about 2 years ago now about polling
Hi, Barbara.
will know some of these things already, but I just thought for those who weren't at that session, it might be good to repeat this. One of the big things in doing surveys are things that need to be measured and to be known. And one is what the margin of error is of the poll, what the confidence level is, and then, of course, interviewing dates. The size of the sample is extremely important. You know, and whether you're talking about a national poll or a statewide poll, there's usually a definition of who is being polled. So if we take the margin of error, almost all surveys are what are called plus or minus 3 percentage points margin of error, and it's percentage points. So if that's the case, and let's say you're having an election like we did in the last one, a nationwide 52% say they're going to vote for Biden and 48% say they're going to vote for Trump, and you have a plus or minus 3 percentage point margin of error, you can easily pick Biden or Trump depending on what the breakout is. So you could have something as broad as Biden has 55%, that's the plus 3 from the 52, or you could have another plus 3 on the Trump side, which means he has 51. In that case, Biden still wins. But you can have situations where Trump would have the higher percentage than Biden would and still be within that 3 percentage point margin of error. So that's an important thing to remember. The polls are not meant to be absolutely precise. And when you're doing a sample, whether it's 1,000 people or 500 people, you're going to have a margin of error. If that margin of error is broad enough, plus or minus 3%, you could say one person's going to win and not be wrong when the other person actually wins because you're within that margin of error. So that's something to keep in mind. Same thing is, we talk about confidence levels of polls, and that really means that 95% of 100 cases, if you repeated those same questions with a cross-section of 1,000 people, you would get the same results, except in maybe 5% of the time because of outliers and other reasons, bad sampling, whatever the case might be. And so the confidence level is at 95 out of 100, which means you still have a 5% chance of error entering into your survey. And the point I want you to just come away with in these two examples is that polls are not meant to be precise. They give you a range of error. They give you confidence levels. They're not meant to call the numbers right on the head. It just doesn't work that way. And, you know, people get all upset when the polls are wrong. And they're right to get upset when somebody says someone's going to win by 10% and they end up either losing or only winning by 2%. And we'll talk about why that happens. But just keep in mind that polls are basically an approximation. They're a snapshot at any given point in time. And we all know that a particular event can change the results markedly depending on what that event was. You know, to give you an example, you know, Trump's approval rating was a lot higher before the takeover of the Capitol building. Once that Capitol building event took place, he dropped like a lead balloon in the approval ratings on the polls. So an event can take place at any given point that changes the results markedly. So keep that in mind. Let's talk just a little bit again briefly about history of polls. The first reported ever example of a poll being done also shows polls limits was during the Civil War. There were a couple of bars, a couple of papers who took what we would call straw polls of people in their bars or people who read their newspapers. And, you know, if the bar or the newspaper was in the North, people would say the North was going to win the Civil War. And if you did it in bars or you did it in storefronts or wherever you did it in the South would say they were going to win the war. So again, it's really important where the poll is being done, how representative it is of a cross-section of people, or whether it's just being done of a specific group in a specific place. In some cases, get a specific answer that they're looking for. So keep that in mind. One of the polls that was called wrong and got the most publicity was when Alf Landon and Harry Truman were running against each other. And there was a magazine called Literary Digest that had about 18,000 readers. And they polled and got results from about 12,000 of those 18,000 readers. And everybody in that group said Alf Landon was going to beat Harry Truman. And then you remember the famous picture of Truman holding up a newspaper that said Landon wins, when in fact Truman won. And the reason why that poll was so wrong was that Literary Digest readers were almost all Republican. So of course they were going to say Landon was going to win, when in fact Truman was the one who actually won the poll. So who you're interviewing and the sampling of who you're interviewing is extremely important to getting an accurate read in what the poll is saying. For a long time, even after that, there were papers like the Daily News in New York, which had a big readership, a couple million people. And they would do straw polls, they called them, of people at different points in time about who was going to win an election. And a lot of times they were right, many times they were wrong, because again, most of the readers who tended to read the Daily News were blue-collar workers and things. So very often those polls were off, certainly by percentages, but sometimes they were completely wrong in terms of who would win and who would not. Now, almost every generation has their favorite pollster that they pick to say is a real guru. He never gets it wrong. And one of those people in the last several years was Nate Silver. You probably heard his voice and saw him on television. He was on cable a lot. And anyway, Nate Silver picked Hillary to beat Trump by a pretty big margin. And I happened to watch him on election night, and he did a funny kind of thing. He started out the night at around 6 o'clock in the evening, saying there was a 90% chance Hillary was going to win and only 10% chance that Trump was going to win. But as more and more states were telling us what their results were, then by 8 o'clock, he had it that it was 80% chance Hillary was going to win and only a 20% chance that Trump was going to win. And this kept changing as the hours went by. So finally, around midnight, he still had Hillary winning, but only 55 to 45. And then, of course, as you know, Trump eventually pulled it out and won that race, much to everybody's surprise, for a lot of people to their chagrin. So the thing about Nate Silver that really annoyed me is when you belong to trade associations that oversee this kind of polling, like the American Association of Public Opinion Polls, which is half made up of commercial research companies and half made up of academics, which is an interesting group to put together because very often As you can imagine, the academics disagree with the commercial pollsters. Not only do you get battles between them, but they do really try to make sure that the science of the polls are strong, because truly polling is much a science as it is an art. And it certainly becomes an art in the way you word the questions, the way you ask people stuff, who you're actually approaching, whether there's groups of people who refuse to answer, and the academics are much more concerned about the science of polling than the art of polling. Whereas the commercial guys, because they're trying to make money on the polls they're doing, like to argue it's more of an art than a science. So you do have a couple of trade associations. There's the National Council of Public Opinion Polls, like APOR, which I mentioned earlier, who do try to regulate and watch over these things and try to call who they think is right and who they think is wrong. And if somebody's way off, then they ask the polling group or the polling person to give up their surveys, to let them look at it, to see why they were so off base in terms of accuracy. Now with Nate Silver, what he was doing in most cases is he would get every opinion poll that was released in a state. So let's take a state like Minnesota, for example. Let's say there were 10 studies going on from different companies that were being released publicly in that state. Well, what he would basically do is average the results of those 10 polls. And so he couldn't be too far off because there are 10 different polling companies, 10 with their own biases or points of view. But if you averaged them together, you came out pretty close. But then he would go further and say, he had some magic sauce, the way he weighted the data or the propensity of the data, he had all kinds of words. But the thing was, I used to ask him to see some of that stuff, and he would never let me see it. And that's a problem. I mean, if you got something to hide, then you won't show all your techniques and stuff to independent people. And the other thing is, if you can't evaluate the poll, you can't see what biases are there or whatever. And so if you belong to APOR, for example, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, and you do polls that are released publicly, you have to be willing to show people the data, the tabs, the questionnaire, everything that went into doing the poll. And when people refuse to do that, it always makes me suspicious, because then generally they got something they're trying to hide or whatever. Anyway, Nate's not very good about giving up his work or his polling or how he does his weighting. And so I've always had a problem with him, although you would have thought, according to the news media, he was the hottest, the best pollster going. And it just wasn't true. But the media will latch on to somebody and say, oh, he's always accurate, or this group is always accurate, because it helps them to sell papers. It helps them to market themselves. It's a way of grabbing public attention. And that's another area that creates a problem. Because if you noticed, a lot of media companies now have gotten into doing their own polling. So you'll have ABC News with the Washington Post. You'll see the New York Times with another group doing the polling. And you got to remember that the bottom line for newspapers and magazines is to sell the newspaper to the magazine. Or if you want people to watch the 7 and 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock news, you may want to go in there because you want to get results that, again, will capture the audience's attention and imagination. So very often, news media, and when the media is involved in actual polling, they're looking to get some kind of sensational response that they can make into a headline or get people to watch a particular news program. And so it's almost like they're using the polling to market themselves. And so I've always been looked a little askance at some of these media polls, not only because when I saw what they did, they weren't that great, but also because they really had a goal in mind, which was to come up with something sensational that would help market their publication. Now, there have been, some well-known pollsters, and polling probably was in its heyday from the 50s through the 1980s. And the reason was that most of the polling then was done door to door. As more and more people got phones, more of the polls were done by telephone. But I can tell you in the 1960s, when I started working in polling, and I was only in high school in the early 60s anyway, there was only 30–40% of households that had telephones. So the standard then was still going door to door. Later on, eventually, 98% of households had phones, and phone polling could be pretty accurate. But there was a time when there wasn't enough people, believe it or not, on phones, or they had party lines, which created problems. So the standard was to do it by going door to door. Now, if you remember in the 1960s, we started to have Jim Crow demonstrations, we had race riots, we also had the Vietnam War going on, and it started getting dangerous for people to go door to door doing surveys. And so what started to happen was white interviewers were afraid to go into black areas. So a company like Lou Harris would hire a local interviewing outfit, let's say in Harlem or East New York or Bedford-Stuy, that had black interviewers. And so we sent black interviewers into black areas and cut back on having white interviewers doing polling in those areas. Once you went to telephone, you didn't have to worry about some of the interviewers being physically threatened or physically harmed. And there were really some nightmare stories when we were doing it door to door, when a nice lady would go in and interview a guy and he didn't like the questions. And in one particular case, he let his 3 German Shepherds up out of the basement to go after the interviewer. And that woman had to dive out a window in order to get away from those dogs. So there was a lot of concern about interviewers getting harmed or research companies getting sued. In that case, we had to buy the woman a new coat. So phone was a lot safer, and that's what we went to. Now, what happened after the 1980s is computers started coming online. And then, now we've got PDAs, and we've got laptops, we got all kinds of different electronic devices. It started to become very hard to know who the heck you were interviewing, because you may be assigned to do a house that has somebody in a different age group, let's say 50 and above, and who answered the poll was some 18-year-old kid in the house. So it wasn't a 50-year-old. They would say they were a 50-year-old and they were a white male, but it could very well turn out they weren't. So that started making polls very inaccurate. Once we started going to online interviewing and we started to do them on different devices like cell phones, we started not really knowing who the heck we were interviewing, and it threw the samples off and it threw the statistical results off. And that's why we've had more sensational examples, whether it's in England or it's in the United States, of polls being wildly wrong. And if you remember in this last election, there were some, pollsters who were saying that Trump in their state was going to lose by 10 percentage points. And when the actual election came around, Trump may only have lost by 1 or 2 points. That's a big error. That's a big mistake to say somebody's going to win by 10% and they only end up winning by 1 or 2%. So polling has become so inaccurate that about 5 years ago, I said, you know what? I'm done polling. I'm not doing it anymore. And I had done it my whole life because I was getting data results that I knew were just wrong. And it was basically because the samples were bad. They got the wrong number of blacks or Hispanics or young women or whatever the case might be. And so I just said, I can't do this anymore because I can't be giving big clients like Pfizer or Merck or the Bank of America, I had some very big accounts, data that's statistically wrong. And I felt there was no way at that time to really correct for all the problems we were having. And I decided it was the right time for me to retire. The other thing was that when I got into polling, a lot of the people who were doing the polls were social scientists or political scientists. So like Dan Yankelovich, you might have heard of his name. He was a social psychologist, and he really looked at people not just by what they said, but also how they lived their lives. He asked a lot of lifestyle questions, and before he'd come back with data, he had a pretty good understanding of that person, not just in terms of how they would vote or what they might buy, but how they were socially, politically, religiously. He took a much broader range of things he asked about to really be sure his data was correct. Then you got people like Lou Harris, who really was a journalist. And Lou, ran the Tar Heel magazine when he was in University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Lou knew how to ask questions and polls so they could get headlines. And very often his questions were oriented so the press would pick up his poll result as a huge headline. And the other thing that he did was he wrote a column 3 times a week for 200 newspapers. So because he was working for newspapers and magazines and getting paid for these polls, he tended to be kind of a sensationalist in terms of the results he was getting. So part of the problem with pollsters is sometimes they have their own personal prejudices, their own personal inclinations, and they can ask questions that almost can get them the answers that they want. And that's always something that if you're going to look at a poll, you've got to evaluate. Is how objective is this person or this organization? What's the margin of error on the polls they're doing? One of the things you'll see, for example, is that, you could do 1,000 people in the United States, and if you do it accurately and you have the right balance of demographics and things, and pretty well predict within that plus or minus 3% what the results would be in an election. The problem today is that too much of the sampling is not projectable. And let me give you an example. Let's say that in the United States right now, we have 12% of the population that's Black. And it might be 14% by now. I haven't looked at recent demographics. And let's say you get your results back and you've only got 3% that are Black. Well, what do pollsters tend to do? They tend to weight that 3% up to the 12 or 14%. Well, if the 3% of Blacks you interviewed were not projectable to all Blacks, all you're doing is weighting garbage. So you got garbage results on the first 3%. You're weighting it up to 12%. You've now made the garbage 4 times worse than it was with the 3%. So weighting schemes can be all over the place. And people have, again, secret sources that they don't want to tell you about. They call them, University of Pennsylvania professor came up with something called propensity weighting. And when you tried to find out all the details of how he was doing propensity weighting, you got some information, but you don't always get all the information. So a lot of times the weighting schemes that are being applied to polls can really be outrageous. Now, another problem that you have, and I mentioned it earlier, is that the pollsters themselves and their techniques can have biases built in. So, for example, Lou Harris was a Democrat. He hung around Democrats all the time. And worse than that, Democrats like Bob Byrd, Tip O'Neill, all those guys would be calling Lou all the time to find the latest poll results that he was coming up with. Now, since I worked at Lou Harris, I knew there were times that we had what we call sample points collapsing. That is, there was an area that we were doing for a particular reason to meet certain demographic needs that we couldn't get enough interviews in that area. So we then pick another area that had similar demographics, we thought, and we'd interview that area instead of the area we originally started with. Well, after a while, these collapse sample points started to have biases built in because whether I realized it or the statisticians realized it, Lou was replacing certain collapse sample points with Democratic sample points that were more Democratic. So after a while, people knew that Harris's polls tended to lean Democratic in their results. And then conversely, George Gallup, who was a Republican, he'd get collapse sample points, replace them with an area he thought was similar but would be more Republican. And he tended to have a reputation of leaning more Republican. And the truth was, they both were. Harris was leaning more Democratic in his sampling points, and Gallup was, more on the Republican side. So when they had collapsed sample points, instead of being absolutely sure they got a new point that was similar to the one that collapsed, very often they picked a point that tended to either be more Democratic or more Republican, which threw some of their poll results in. Now, if you look at the polls that were done during the Trump-Biden race, for example, you were getting some wildly different results. A guy named Rasmussen, who's up in the Midwest, his polls tended to be more pro-Trump. He was getting margins of error being closer, to what the actual votes tended to be. SSRS, which is here in Pennsylvania, has a pretty good reputation. They work a lot with ABC News. They were getting some very broad wins for Biden in the same states that Rasmussen was showing them being close. And then you had ABC also hooking up with the Washington Post, getting different results. And you had the New York Times and whoever they were working with, I forget what company, they were getting different results. So when you start seeing polls being wildly different, you can be sure stuff is going on that isn't good in terms of accuracy. And, the thing you always got to worry about is who's doing the poll and what are their biases. And, are they pushing a point of view? Are they doing more what I would call an advocacy poll than a really objective poll? And one of the problems with media, and I go back to this again, I'll say for the third time, media is always looking for headlines. They're always looking for a sensational result that'll get you to buy their newspaper, their magazine, or to watch the 6, 7, 10, 11 o'clock news. So I'm always concerned when the media is in the middle of doing polling. And if you're an academic and you're really trying to be objective and you're really trying to say, who's really likely to win here, well, you're really focused in on getting accuracy. You're not worried about getting a freaking headline. So that's always an issue. The other issue is how you word your questions. You can get widely divergent results depending on how you word questions. I think I told you when I was talking to you about basics of polling, we asked a question once on a national cross section about how much stock you own. And we were getting these wild numbers in the Southwest of people holding stock, whereas, most brokerage houses would tell you that most people who own stock and bonds are on the East Coast and the West Coast. We were getting this crazy result in the Southwest, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. Well, we went back into the field and we asked people, we ask you, how much stock do you own? What kind of stock are you talking about? And we found out in the Southwest, they were talking about how many heads of cattle they own or how many sheep they own. They were thinking of livestock, whereas everywhere else they were thinking about, investment instruments. So just that, kind of wording can throw you crazily off. So you have to be really quite careful. If you look at a lot of the polls that were done during the Biden, Trump election, you'll see things like, are you going to vote for Joe Biden, who's trying to bring this country together, or Donald Trump, who's creating all kinds of harm in the nation? Well, that's not an objective question. And depending on how you feel about things, you're going to say one candidate or the other candidate, where it should just be simply, are you going to vote for Donald Trump or are you going to vote for Joe Biden? Just that. Don't put in these qualifiers and descriptions of them and what their position is. on that kind of thing if you're looking for accuracy. So question wording is of prime importance. And again, I go back to the point I made earlier. Polling is as much an art as it is in science. And either one of those sides of the equation can throw the poll off. And again, remember, events can change data significantly. So you can get certain results one week, but if you have a big event, like something that happens when people are trying to take over the Capitol building, those numbers are going to change by huge percentages. So you have to keep in mind also what events are going on at the time the poll is done, or what events happen after the poll is done that might change it. So those are the things I kind of wanted to talk about and get out there. And that's the first half hour. The next half hour we have, I want to open it up to all of you. I want you to ask me any question you want, or tell me any bias or prejudice you have against polling. But I really want this to be two-way and us to really talk about this, because it's a huge problem today about polling. I actually believe, this is my personal belief, and it's only Nick Tortorella's personal belief, I would be extremely happy if they stopped doing political polling. I think political polling ruins the whole business because so many times it's wrong. There's too many personal biases that get introduced into it. And it really does kill the good side of the business, such as like when I worked for Pfizer and they wanted to know if one of their heart medications was causing early mortality. I mean, and that's where the poll results are going to affect life or death. And those questions have got to be asked objectively. You've got to have doctors involved, other healthcare professionals involved, and really make sure you have an objective poll if you're going to find out if a drug's causing early mortality. You also have to make sure you're getting a wide range of different patients who have cardio disease. And you also have to be interviewing doctors from GPs to cardiologists to get a really good handle on it. Well, the results can be very accurate. I mean, I found out, for example, that a drug that Pfizer was worrying about causing early mortality was in fact not causing early mortality. It was the best drug they had ever found on controlling blood pressure. So where are all these stories that were appearing that Pfizer was killing people? Well, it turned out to be a rival pharmaceutical company who had two doctors out writing articles and giving speeches about why Pfizer's drug was killing people. And what ended up happening in that case, true story, chairman of Pfizer called the chairman of Merck and said, cut this shit out, get those doctors out of there, or we're going to sue you to smithereens. And Merck did. They stopped saying the drug caused early mortality. So there's a case
with a good RX thing.
Here's a case of internecine warfare going on between two drug companies, and it's got people so concerned that a particular drug company is killing people. I could give you another example, and Dan, I know you'll be interested in this because it has to do with MS. We had a drug by Serrano, and I forget the other drug company, that helped to ease the symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And we were hearing stories that the drug was not helping with symptoms, it was causing people worse symptoms, more intense symptoms, and all that sort of thing. So we went out and did a survey, and again, there were doctors involved with me and other healthcare professionals, and the drug, probably better I don't mention the drug if somebody will end up suing me. It turned out the drug was terrific. And one of the techniques we used was a technique where we'd say to a MS patient, there's this new drug that supposedly does X, Y, Z. Opponents of that drug say it does this, does this, does this. Suppose there was a 90% chance that the drug would help you, but a 10% chance that the drug would kill you. Would you take the drug? And these MS patients, in a lot of cases, were in a lot of pain and anguish, and we had to get to 60-40, that there was a 40% chance it would kill you, before the MS patients would say they wouldn't take the drug. Up to that point, they said they would take the drug. And I had to take these results to the FDA and show them exactly how the study was done, the sampling was done, give them the question wording, show them the data results, give them all this stuff. And the drug that they initially said no to, they ended up allowing. And the drug has done a lot of good for those MS patients. So polling, when it's done right, can do great things and really help people. But these damn political polls are so inaccurate and so all over the place. It hurts really good polling that's needed on life and death issues. And similarly, on issues that the country may be facing, like immigration or DACA or any of those kinds of things, if the poll's done well and done accurately, it could give the president or Congress some good thoughts and ideas to be considered when making decisions about those issues. But the polls have got to be done objectively, and they've got to be done honestly and according to Hoyle, with no one really having a point of view, but other than to find out what truth is. And unfortunately, that's all getting besmirched by political polling, because political polling has become a case of the tail wagging the dog instead of the dog wagging the tail. So it's a shame that polling is getting looked at worse as being worse and worse and inaccurate. And that's why I got out of the business, because I didn't want to go to Pfizer on some life or death issue and give them bad poll results. I had to make sure the sampling was done right, the questions were objective, the people that we interviewed were the correct people to be interviewing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my pitch, and that's my own personal feelings, and there's nothing more than my personal beliefs about polling. And with that, I want to throw it open to all of you and let you ask any questions you want to.
Hey, Nick,
Yeah,
do you think there's any actual deliberately erroneous polling? For example, if I'm told my candidate is 10 points behind, I may just stay home and say, what the heck? Or if I'm told erroneously that my candidate is within 1%, please send money, blah, 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 get out and vote, I'll do something different. So do you think there's any pollsters that are deliberately partisan and shading their polls?
Absolutely. There are pollsters who only work for Democrats. There are pollsters who only work for Republican candidates, and they're hired because they're hired guns. So let me parse all the questions you've asked. You asked about 10 questions there. Let's start with the bandwagon effect and the underdog effect. I used to believe that those two things canceled themselves out. And when I say I used to believe, I'm talking about, the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s, because I could never see where if you said somebody was winning by 10%, you could create a bandwagon effect, but then there was people who felt sorry for that person or really wanted that person to win who was 10 points behind, and they would vote for it. So you had people who were getting on the bandwagon when somebody was 10 points ahead, and there were people who were voting for the underdog because somebody was 10%. They tended to cancel each other out. They don't cancel each other out anymore. If you keep saying that Biden's going to win by 10 to 20 points, you can be darn sure a lot of people are going to jump on that bandwagon who are in the middle, independents, whatever. And there's nobody who was feeling sorry for Donald Trump. So you weren't getting any people voting for him because he was the underdog. The votes he was getting were for people who were really strongly believed in him, and some people would label zealots, which is a prejudicial term. But the bottom line is that there is bandwagon and underdog effects today more than ever before. So they don't cancel each other out. The other thing that you kind of touched on was there's a lot of polling that's done for candidates before they decide to run. like, I'll give you a perfect example, and I can talk about this because he was my client, and that was Howard Baker of Tennessee. Howard Baker came to me and said, "You have a good reputation of being an objective pollster. I want you to do polls for me in New Hampshire and Vermont and tell me if I have a chance of winning those two states in primaries." This was in primaries. And I went up there and I did cross sections of people in New Hampshire and people in Vermont. And there was no way Howard Baker could win, you know? And I told him, I said, "Howard, you'd have no name recognition. They think of you being from the South, even though you're from Tennessee. A lot of people respect you, but they don't think you're presidential timber." And Howard said, "Thank you very much," and went home. He didn't run. Now, I will mention a candidate who, it's very hard for me not to say his name. Some of you will be smart enough to guess, but he came to me and told me he wanted to run for president. I had two partners at the time. And I thought personally he was a little off his rocker, but he had been a governor in that state and he was well known and he was good looking and a lot of people liked him. And we sat in, we were sitting in his office, I won't say in Arkansas, and we were doing a poll for him about the state. This was after he had won, then he lost, I think it was the governorship, and he wanted to come back. And so we did a statewide poll on what issues were most important to those people. And we asked about the death penalty, we asked about utility rates, we asked about every, you know, kind of issue there was in that particular state. And we got to the presentation on the data, and we're presenting the data to him. And he says, "You know, this is a waste of time." And I'm like, "Why is this a waste of time?" He goes, "You just tell me what to say so I can win." And that was him. Just tell me what to say so I win. He didn't care what the poll results were. He was just, "I want to win. Tell me how to win." So you get candidates like that as opposed to Howard Baker. The other problem with those kinds of polls that are done when somebody's thinking of running is they're trying to show they can win so they can fundraise, which you also talked about, Dave. That's why I said you asked about 10 questions. And so these pollsters are being paid to go back and not say you're going to lose or there's no chance in hell. They go back and say, "Yeah, you can win. And if you follow my instructions and you follow the issues I tell you to talk about, you can win." And what they try to do is basically give poll results to the candidate so he can go to wealthy people and wealthy groups and say, "See, I can win. Look at this poll." So those polls are being done, they're advocacy polls, and they're polls that are being done for one reason, to show somebody that they can win so they can raise tons of money for their election. So those polls, of course, are very suspect, as you might imagine. And they're being asked biased questions that are purposely biased to show that somehow that candidate can win so he can raise money. Or in some cases, he'll turn it over to the press and say, "Look, I just had a poll done and I'm going to beat my opponent by 20 points. It's garbage. It's lies. It's junk. Now, I'll give you an example in the commercial world. I went before a guy who was who's the president of a huge investment brokerage house. And he wants to do a survey of investors, and he wanted to do a very big survey. He wanted to look at minority groups too. He was about 2,000 or 3,000 interviews he wanted to do. And then let me just tell you again on the basics that if I tell you the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, and you say to me, "Well, I want a poll that we can do that's plus or minus only 2%, you may have to do another 2,000 questions to try to, lessen that margin of error by 1%. So at some point it becomes ridiculous because you'll be paying a fortune to try to get it down to 2 or 1% when you don't need to do that. 3% generally works good enough, except in political polling. But anyway, I go before this president of this huge brokerage house, and he tells me the kinds of questions he wants and how much interviewing he wants us to do in the groups and things. I say to him, okay, as long as I have control of the questionnaire, I make final decisions about whether or not the question is biased. And I gave him a couple of the ground rules. And he said to me, wait a minute, I'm going to pay you $175,000 to do this poll, and I can't get the results I want? I said, no, you cannot get the results you want. If it happens to come out that way, great. But I can't promise or guarantee you that what we're doing, you're going to get the results you want. He goes, I'm wasting $175,000. I said, you're paying $175,000 to know the truth. He goes, I don't want the truth. To be the brokerage house. That's a true story. I had to walk out. I mean, I literally walked out, said, I'm not your guy. I might have said something racist like, I'm not your boy. But I mean, he got the point. And I walked out, and somebody else he hired did that poll for him, got all the answers he wanted. The next year, he lost like a third of his customer base. So these things, are very touchy. They involve sometimes millions of dollars. You want to work for clients who want to know the truth. You don't want to work for clients that are paying you to get results. Now, I'll give you an example of where it worked well. If you remember, at one time, Jesse Helms was running for Senate in North Carolina, and Jesse had a technique. Every 6 years he was running for the Senate, he would latch on to some national issue. So the people back home would say, that a boy, Jesse, go get him, Jesse. What he was trying to do was rile his North Carolina base up against the rest of the country. So he would get into issues that he knew how people in North Carolina felt versus people in the nation. And he would latch on to that issue so he'd get reelected. So Jesse Helms decides this time that he's running for reelection for the Senate, that he's going to latch on to the fact that the National Endowment for the Arts is funding obscene art. Now, fortunately, he had a good case in that he showed that taxpayer money through the National Endowment for the Arts was being used to fund art exhibits by Mapplethorpe and Serrano. Now, Mapplethorpe and Serrano are very avant-garde artists. So they had things like crucifixes in urine in their pictures. They had pictures of elephant dung being put on canvases. And they called this stuff art. And believe it or not, a lot of museums picked up their work, controversial as it was, and put it in their galleries, art galleries and museums, as though making it kind of credible art. Well, Jesse Helms went crazy and said, your taxpayer money is funding anti-Christian, biased art, and how do you feel about it? Well, of course, people were not happy about it. And so there were hearings about whether or not the National Endowment should get rechartered and get taxpayer money to fund artists and art events. And I got called in by Norman Lear, you have All in the Family fame, and his organization. And they wanted to know whether we could do an objective poll on this whole question of taxpayer money being used to fund obscene art, where the American public was on this, and if it came to a national vote, how would people vote? And I sat in there, and they obviously had their point of view, and Jesse Helms had his point of view, and I made the same thing clear to them that I made to that CEO of a major brokerage house. I have to have final word on the questions. They have to be objective. The sampling has to be objective. Here are the ground rules, and you got to pay $100,000 to do this and do it right. And I told them, you know, this is going to get huge press coverage. This is an important issue. I'm going to be in front of every TV camera, radio, God knows where, answering these poll results. So I'm not losing my career over this. And unless you guys are going to do this right and objectively, again, I'm not your guy to do this. There are a lot of other pollsters. Sure, a lot of pollsters will do what you want, but I'm not doing it. And I got up and walked out. And I got to the elevator, and the president of the organization came and grabbed me and said, "Come back. Let's talk about this some more." So we went back, and you know, Norman Lear and all these people are there, and we talked it through, and they finally agreed to my terms. So I did this survey, and the one thing I made sure of is that every argument that Jesse Helms made against the National Endowment was on that questionnaire. So there were questions that supported the National Endowment's position, and every one of Jesse Helms's arguments against the National Endowment was on that questionnaire. Because I didn't want anybody to say it was biased. So I knew that would be the kiss of death. So I did the survey, and it came out only 15% of the public agreed with Jesse Helms' position. That most people felt art was free speech. People felt that artists test the outside of the envelope all the time. That what you might find offensive by one artist, another person might see as a blessing. So the American people were pretty well balanced in the way they answered the survey. But bottom line, there was only 15% who said, "I wouldn't read the chart of the National Endowment. We think it does much more good than it does harm." Well, when those survey results came out, I got called by so many congressmen and senators, my head was spinning. And the bottom line to that was I had to go before 2 congressional committees and testify on those survey results, defend the questions, defend the sampling, defend the data. And, you know, I did the best I could. You know, I got up in front of those committees and I answered. One was Ways and Means. I forget what the other committee was. And these were, Ways and Means was a very strong committee with a lot of strong personalities on it. And after I testified, a couple of congressmen and senators came up to me and said, "Can I take you to lunch?" So they took me to the Senate cafeteria, lunchroom, whatever you want to call it. Had very good food, by the way. I don't like Navy bean soup, but it was the best Navy bean soup I'd ever had. And a couple of them said to me, "Until we heard your survey results, we were going to vote against rechartering the National Endowment." And I have lawyers in my state telling me that we shouldn't, you know, recharter the National Endowment. And they said, "But your results really are impactful. The way you did it was impactful. And I'm going to change my vote. I'm going to vote for rechartering the National Endowment." And to make a long story short, the National Endowment got rechartered, but on the proviso that it's reviewed every year. Their budget's reviewed every year. And every year the Congress could say, "We're not rechartering it for next year." That was the controls they put on the fact that they were going to vote for recharter. I don't know if they still do that or not. I haven't been in touch with those people in years. I don't know whether they still recharter it on a yearly basis or they do it on a 5-year basis now or what they do. But those are examples of where clients, I don't know whether they mean well or don't mean well, but they got a point of view and they want their point of view to come out in the results. And they'll pay you almost anything to do that. And that's a danger. I luckily was working for big enough companies and I had bosses who understood what I was doing and why I was doing it. And they supported me. And, you know, I've got to always thank them that they were in my corner. There were times I got yelled at. There were times I got told, "You're going to screw me up with the Democratic Party, or you're going to screw me up with the Republican Party." And I said, "Well, that's not my intent. My intent is to be as accurate and honest as I can." But I was lucky in those years that I had bosses that did support what I was doing. I eventually went out on my own and had my own businesses. So all I had to answer to was myself. But it's very hard, I can tell you in survey research, to do the work well and to sell the work. if you have a firm and you got a lot of employees and interviewers, you got to keep feeding them work, and it means you got to be selling all the time. And I also wanted to be involved in doing the work. I had good people who could write questionnaires, and I got people who I eventually could trust that I could just review their stuff and not have to redo it or something. But it's a tough business. A lot of times you don't get paid as much as you should get paid to do some of the things you do. There's some things you do in the public interest. There's some things you do pro bono because you think it'll advance society and it'll be a help to the world. I used to always say that the reason why I do the business is to make the country better and to make the world better. And that's how I approach dealing with clients and how I approach doing the work. Dan, I saw you had a question. You're on mute, Dan. Mute. Dan, mute. Dan's looking at the front. Oh, there you go. Dan.
I'm always muted.
Yeah, don't mute yourself. When you're on with me, you don't have to mute.
Maybe by the time I get done, you'll change your attitude. I don't know, but 2 points here. One, in terms of the impact on the whole polling situation, one is the technology issue. I have what's called, you may not be familiar with it, it's called a landline. I actually have a phone here, you know.
Yep. I still have one too.
Okay, that's kind of a dinosaur now, but you look at what's happened over the ages of polling and so on, that's been one of the changes. And now that they are not that common anymore, and it's only people's personal phones, mobile phones, what impact that has on things. To me, it would have a considerable impact. That's point one. Point two, to what extent, this is very timely, this debacle we've been through over the last election periods and so on. I'm not saying that politically, but let's face it, it's been a lot of concerns here. To what extent has that impacted people's belief in the whole polling concept, period? I mean, there seems to be a lot of just plain negative points of view, whether Democrat or Republican, on whether polling has got a future. Both of those points, technology and then that other issue. What do you think?
Yeah, very good questions, Dan. Let's take your last question. Yeah, it was a debacle this time. It hurt polling tremendously. I was glad this year I had gotten out of it 5 years ago. And I don't think it has a future right now, because the problem is you can't control who's actually answering the survey. If you've got a cell phone and it rings and you're not in the room and your kid's in the room, the kid can pick it up and answer the survey. And we have no way of knowing that. When it was a landline phone, less of that would take place. Mobile phones are mobile phones. People take them with them to different places. They may feel differently in one location than they would if they were at home. I think when we had landline phones, we tended to get more honest answers than we do on mobile phones. There's also a problem that it's getting to be less of a problem, but still a problem, that a lot of minority groups don't have cell phones, which means you can get an underrepresentation of minority groups. So cell phones, PDAs, computers, all those electronic gadgets have real problems in terms of control over who's actually answering the survey. What was your first question, Dan?
About landlines versus technology, landlines versus.
No, I answered that. Landlines are better than all the new technology. You had another question.
The other one had to do, you kind of answered that too, the impact of this election,
Oh, yeah.
the last two elections and so on.
Yeah, I mean, this has hurt polling. And the other thing to notice is that it's not just the United States. Look how wrong Great Britain's polling was over Yeltsin, over what's his name? Who?
Brexit.
Brexit, but also the guy, Johnson, right?
Oh, Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson. And by the way, Ted, you were right. The Roosevelt thing was with Dewey, and I mean, Dewey was with Truman, and the other one was with
Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt. Reverse those guys. But again, there were biases in both. Go ahead, Ted.
Nick, I would amplify on the cell phone versus landline. I think another issue that comes into play is that the landlines tended to be geographically distinct, whereas you can have a 484 cell phone number that's generally issued in the greater Philly area, but be living in California.
You're exactly right. I have kept my cell phone number from New York. So I have a 914 number,
Yeah.
which was for Rockland and Westchester at
Yeah.
that time. Now, 914 is only Westchester. It's not even Rockland anymore.
And you live here.
And I'm living in Pennsylvania. And I've gotten called on polls, and they think they're talking to me in New York.
Yeah.
And I say to them, before you start this, let me just tell you, I don't live in New York anymore. I live in Pennsylvania. So do you really still want me to be in your interview? I'm still in your sample. So that's what I was saying about mobile phones create a lot of problems. If you take that number with you, you can be living totally in a different place than where you got the number, which can throw your sampling off. So, yeah, mobile phones create all kinds of problems. The other thing with mobile phones is a lot of times parents give it to their kids to use, and their kids on the phone and not them. And we have no way of knowing that unless we start asking demographic questions. Now, the problem with doing that is you can start out by saying, what's your age? Where do you live? Well, a lot of demographic stuff. But by the time you get through the demographic questions, people want to get off the phone already.
Yeah.
And not only that, but anybody could be calling them in the next 5 or 10 minutes on their mobile phone. So they'll tell you, you got to speed this up. I'm expecting a phone call, which can really throw you off. And you're only asking some questions, not all the questions. So mobile phones create enormous problems for polling.
Nick, how about the problem of lying? I mean, nobody wants to get on the list to be deprogrammed or embarrassed on social media. So,
or your college degree
people start to lie.
Taken away. This is a really good question, and I've been struggling with it. And now, if you're a deplorable and they want to take away your college degree, they might try to do that. So, at one time, I was really confident that 98% of people were telling us what they really believed. Now I would say it may be as bad as 70%, 60% are telling us the truth. There are people who will purposely lie. And one of the things that's really been a problem with Trump is that, you remember Richard Nixon started this whole thing about a silent majority, that there are a lot of people out there who aren't going to say they're going to vote for me, and they're going to vote for me on election day. Well, he turned out to be wrong then. But it's very true with Trump that a lot of people got to a point where they wouldn't say they were going to vote for him because they were taking too much heat from their neighbors and their families. I mean, I can't tell you how many families had breakups and things over this last election. It created schisms that are so deep, I don't know how they get healed. And the divisiveness that's so deep, I don't know how they get healed. Because there are zealots on both sides. And there are terrible things said about others on both sides. And unfortunately, if you look at the rhetoric from the congressmen, again, whether they're reps or the Senate, they're using very insightful language all the time on both sides. They're supporting, I would say, questionable groups on both sides. The divide is huge. And people who know me and have called me, and I still have old clients who call me, who were calling me about this election, I said, if we're not careful, this election will reflect a new civil war. We're getting to that point of anger and hatred and inability to speak to one another civilly or with respect. And it can cause civil war. And a lot of my friends laughed at me at the beginning. Nobody was laughing at me now. Look what happened with the Capitol building. That all started with Timothy McVeigh blowing up the federal building. That's where people started taking sides. And McVeigh was executed as an example of what not to do in terms of insurrection. Then you had the problem with that family up in the Northwest where people took sides about the government taking their land. This has been going on for years. This divisiveness has been seething for a number of years. The hatred has been increasing for a number of years. I was in Gettysburg on July 4th, and I saw an incident, and it was just like watching what happened in Cuba in The Godfather. If you remember when Michael went to Cuba with the Jewish mafia guy, I forget his name, and Lansky. And they see this guy, this Cuban, blow himself up, among a bunch of Cuban cops. And Meyer Lansky says to him, "What does that tell you, Michael?" And Michael says, "That side could win," talking about the Castroites. And of course, they did win. So I'm in Gettysburg, and I'm leaving to go look at the statues. I went through the films, and I went through the museum, and I'm going out to look at the monuments and stuff. And this is just this past July 4th. And all of a sudden, the cars on the road come to a complete stop. Next thing I know is I see guys coming over the hills and out of trees with all kinds of guns, from automatic rifles to revolvers, you name it, they had it. And they had surrounded this car, 2 cars ahead of me. And it turned out there were Antifa people in there yelling out to them, saying god-awful things to them. And these guys were armed, and they got on their cell phones. And next thing you knew, there were 500 people with weapons surrounding this Antifa car. Okay, this is 2 cars ahead of me. I had Ann McNally in the car with me, and I said, if they start shooting, get on the floor of the car. We couldn't move. I mean, we're boxed in. Next thing I know, a number of park rangers on horseback come running in on horses to break up around the people around the Antifa car. Next thing I see is one of these black Suburbans with national security people in the car, getting these guys out of the Antifa car into their car. They take possession of their car and got them out of there before people started shooting at each other. And I looked at Ann and said, this is how close we are to civil war. Those people were there because they heard Antifa was going to show up. They knew Antifa was threatening to break up some of the monuments. And these militia guys, these local militia guys, were there in force, all spread throughout the park. When they gave the word that Antifa was in this car, they came flying over the hills. You would have thought it was another battle of Gettysburg. It was scary. It was absolutely frightening to see that many weapons. And a lot of these guys are young. They're only in their 20s and 30s. How mature were you in your 20s and 30s? And they were ready to go to war with these guys in the Antifa car. Those guys in the Antifa car had shot at them. I mean, they would have all been obliterated because there were many more militia than there were then. But that's how close we are. That's how close we are to civil war. Now, Biden's doing the right thing, saying things to try to bring the country together. But if that rhetoric changes, and some people believe it's already changed, or they go through a second impeachment of Trump, we're really teetering on war. This is not a joke.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I agree wholeheartedly with that.
I'm a political scientist, and I've studied this my whole life. I mean, I know about revolutions and how they happen. I know how things can get so bad that countries literally fall apart at the seams. We're getting close. If our politicians don't learn to work together and compromise, we're all in trouble. It doesn't matter that we live in some nice area of Pennsylvania. It will get here too, if it's not already here. So if you remember in the movie The Thing, at the end they say, keep watching the skies if you're flying saucers. In this case, we got to keep watching our politics, or we're all going to be in the middle of a battle. This is scary stuff. And you know that Pence got away from that crowd by 1 minute. Would they have done anything to Pence because he didn't go the way they want? Who knows? You know, if they had gotten to Nancy Pelosi, what would have happened? I mean, that's how close we are. We are on the brink. And somebody better quiet this all down and get people to work together again and compromise, or we're doomed as a country. Seriously, I believe that is a political science.
You know,
Anybody else?
for many years, I'd hoped that I might receive phone calls asking my opinion on this, that, or the other thing. And now, because of so many occasions when I've answered the phone, and it's been just crappy, harassing, not harassing, but unimportant phone calls, I don't even answer the phone anymore. Uh, we have Comcast, and if I'm watching television and the phone rings, the information about who is calling flashes on the TV screen. I don't even bother getting up to answer the phone.
A lot more people now are not answering their phone than ever before.
Yeah, so the whole idea of getting my opinion just doesn't exist anymore.
Right. And the other question you could ask, because it's asked all the time, how come some people have been interviewed 5 or 8 times and I've never been interviewed?
Yeah.
And the reason for that is the way they do sampling in the 100 sample points for national cross section. They pull tend to be the same or similar ones than others. So as a result, if you're in them and other sample points that come up all the time because of the demographics of that area, you may be called 8 or 10 times already. Whereas if you're not in one of those sample points that are demographically projectable, you never get one. Mm-hmm. So you got a bias there as well. So that's another question that's asked all the time. The truth is that's because the sample points are not projectable. Dan?
I like to talk, and I like to talk to people on the phone. And however, I found that over the last several years, most of the people that called wanted my money or my vote.
Right.
And that became an issue. And the other, along with that, was the technology of that voice telling me who was calling me, so I could. So I felt guilty about going through my phone calls, but it got to a point where, besides that, it took me. By the time I got to the phone, they disappeared anyhow. So anyhow, that whole situation, it goes along with what was said earlier about the veracity of the polling result. I'm not a someone who's going to show up in a polling result for those reasons. And I could be representative of a lot of the people out there, I would think.
Right. And particularly, it would be really bad if somebody was doing a study on health and well-being and you're not answering, because you're a really important kind of person to answer on that kind of survey.
Okay.
And we're missing. You know, so if I was doing a study for the MS Society and you're not answering your phone, I got a problem right there. I'm missing the most crucial person, the one that I need to talk to.
What you have to do there, you have to work it out that you have to try to get a hold of people who are slow. You know, you have to, instead of after 5 rings, you have to say after 10 rings, you get rid of it, you know, so.
Now, you know what we do, Dan, to try to deal with that is we try to send you a letter ahead of time. you get a letter with a stamp on it that says, you know, we're doing a study by the MS Society, and we'd really like to have your point of view and your opinion about some drugs or whatever it is, and let you know that it's legitimate ahead of time, and then ask you to let us know when would be best time to interview you, to get your full attention, whatever. And so we have techniques to try to do that so we don't lose somebody like you. But it's getting to be a real problem. And those kinds of things, surveys can really be helpful because there's no axe to grind. One thing about most drug companies, and I know I'll get pushback on this, David Cadell may push back on it, but having worked for Pfizer, Merck, and some of the other big pharmaceutical companies, most of them want to know the truth. They aren't really trying to sell you their drug or anything else. They want to know what you really believe about your illness and what kinds of things you need help with. And are you following your drug regimen? If you're not following your drug regimen, why aren't you? So I'd say of all the different industries I've worked for, they were always the most honest and wanted to know the truth.
Well, these specialty drugs are extraordinarily expensive.
Yes, they are.
So you're not talking about, you know, you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So,
right. And that's another whole issue. Like the drug I was talking about was Tisabri.
Right. Yeah.
Which was done by Serrano. And, you know, that's a very expensive drug. And a lot of insurance, at least at the beginning, I don't know now, you would know better than I, would not cover it. They called it experimental. And yet we had all these results showing it had great effect with patients. And it took a long time to get them to lower the prices or get them to come up with something that was more realistic so that more people who had MS could take the drug, especially at level 5 or 6. Forget all the different levels of MS there are. You would know that better.
But then it was killing people, and that's not the kind of side effects you want in a drug.
Well, I got hired to find out why it was killing people. And it turned out if you were taking monooxidase inhibitor and Tisabri, there was a chance you would die. If you weren't taking a monooxidase inhibitor, you wouldn't have died. Now, you tell me why I was able to find that out and all their scientists and doctors couldn't. I mean, the chairman of Pfizer looked at me and said, "You're a wonder worker. Our freaking doctors and scientists didn't come up with this. You found it. That one other drug, if you were taking with the Sabri, that could kill you." So, you know, that's the other thing. You think they're experts, whether in law or in drugs or this. Sometimes if you just go as an objective human being and say, how do I find out what may be killing these people? How do I do it? You can come up with a way to do it, to find the answer. But a lot of times, you know, doctors have their own prejudices and biases, or scientists have their own prejudices and biases. To really find people who can be objective about anything is extraordinarily difficult. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I got to tell you that the FDA requires you to record and assimilate all concomitant medications. So that data was there. The physicians were not providing it to their leadership. You had a straight line to the leadership and you gave them the honest truth. I bet if I went into that data at that drug company, I could have found that effect easily.
I agree with you. I agree with you, but it shows how they miss things. And
yeah. And let me say one more thing, Nick. You've really kind of touched on an issue that goes into how drugs are developed, because the question is so important. If I'll give you a pill and half of them are sugar and half of them, and I ask you how much pain or how much better do you feel? Are you out of pain? At least 30% of you will think the sugar pill took away your pain.
Correct.
I did that in migraine.
That's correct.
So many of our clinical trials are biased because question appropriate said is quintessential. It is the most important how you phrase your question. So
Yes.
kudos to you. You've really
You're breaking up, Dave.
me, see how broadly surveys are problems of various types of surveys.
Okay, Dave, you broke up a lot, so I missed some of the stuff at the end, but yeah, I agree with your basic point. Wayne?
No, I love my wife. She's very nice. I'm not breaking up with her.
Mhm.
Yeah, your picture froze though.
One other thing here is over the past couple of weeks, past month, on the computer, I've been getting a lot of polls, and polls are of interest to me. And I click on it. Do I want to say yes or do I want to say no? I click on the appropriate answer, and that takes me to another screen where I'm asked the same question again. I put in the yes or the no, and then submit. Got to put in my name, email address, and so forth. And then I scroll down to the bottom, and it says if you submit this, it means that you are accepting future phone calls that may be commercial or something like that. So then I go back and I erase everything, which defeats the whole purpose of the online polls.
Right. Well, you remember, we used to promise everybody anonymity.
Yeah.
Into this poll and nobody will know who answered it and whatever. Now, because it's getting harder and harder to interview people. Let me give you an example of that. When I started out in the polling business, and our cooperation rates probably ran 65 to 70%.
Oh.
People that we contacted would answer the survey. We're down to 7 and 8%.
Wow.
And that in itself is a bias.
Oh, there's
I just want to say, Nick, a great presentation. Thank you very much. And as far as the importance of how a question is phrased, I remember this from lawyers. The famous question, you may have heard of it. The question to a person on the witness stand is, do you still beat your wife? No matter how you answer yes or no, you're screwed. So that's a perfect example of how questions can be phrased to be biased.
Yeah, and part of the thing too is a lot of questions today are longer than they should be. Polls are longer, much longer than they should be. And that's because a lot of these questions include editorializing in the question.
Yes.
Instead of it just being a straight like yes, no, agree, disagree.
Yeah.
They put so much thing in there. You don't even know what you're agreeing with and what you're disagreeing with. They have too many parts to them. So there's so many problems with polling. That somebody who really cares about it, as I do as a political scientist, I stopped doing it. I mean,
Yeah.
I just couldn't deal with the kinds of data I was getting back and trying to deal with clients who were constantly trying to bias the questionnaire or pay ridiculous sums of money to give them what they wanted. That it just said this isn't worth it anymore.
I'm going to send you a recent poll that I got, and if you answered yes, the rest of the explanation was contrary to what you were trying to get done.
Right.
And I sent that off to one of our family members here, and he said, "Yeah, it's completely stupid. I'll send it to you just for the hell of it, you know."
Yeah, sure. But the other thing too is that I get called on polls a lot, and I do them only because I want to see if it's a good poll or bad poll, just to understand what's going on. And I am amazed at how biased some of the questions and the way the things are done. And I will I'll ask the interviewer for the head of the company. Most of them won't even tell you what company they're doing it for, or who heads it or whatever, what group they're with. But if you can get it, I've written letters to them saying, this questionnaire was biased, and let me point out the reasons. They don't fix them. They don't change them.
Yeah.
They're getting paid. They don't give a shit whether it's right.
Yeah.
That's the scary thing.
Nick, I appreciate your last comment because I look at this group and I don't think we should have ended our session with the terms, do you still beat your wife? So that, that's good. Good job, by the way.
Thank you. All right, guys, we went way past the time, so I need to let all of you go now. It's almost 11:30. But I love
you.
this stuff. I'm always willing to answer any question or comment you have about it. And always feel free to call me, write me, whatever you want to do. I'll be happy to help you out.
Thank you for a good day.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, gals.
Thank you.
Thank
Hey,
you both.
hey, Ted,
Yes,
Ted, I have a question for you.
okay.
Yeah, next week, we're scheduled to